Hi, I'm Tim, guitar player, teacher. In the last several videos, we discussed and built major and minor scales and used them to create all of our key signatures. Each of those scales were defined by the formula of whole steps and half steps that are found within them. In fact, every interval we have discussed so far has been measured in whole steps and half steps. However, there is a much better way to describe intervals and, like much of music theory, it starts with the major scales. First, I'd like to quickly discuss the difference between melody and harmony. These two terms are very commonly used in music, but not often defined very clearly. As they pertain to intervals, a melodic interval is one in which the two notes happen one at a time. In other words, the second note comes only after the first note has ended. So a melody is a series of notes occurring one at a time. A harmonic interval is one in which the two notes are happening at the same time, creating harmony between the two notes. This has absolutely no bearing on how we describe the actual interval between the notes, but it is important to know the difference. We're going to start by simply numbering the notes of the major scale. Every interval will be measured from the tonic of a major scale. Whatever the first note is, we will use that major scale. The position the second note has within the scale is the first part of the name for that interval. This is called the interval's quantity. So if I wanted to know the interval from C to E, I would use the C major scale. Since E is the third note of the scale, I would call that interval a third. From C to E is a third. If I want to know the interval from B flat to G, I would use the B flat major scale. Since G is the sixth note of that scale, we would call that interval a sixth. From B flat to G is a sixth. Now, since the major scales always rise in pitch as we go through their notes, all of our intervals need to be thought of as rising. Obviously, not all intervals rise in pitch in music, but we will deal with descending intervals later. For now, just keep in mind every interval is going up in pitch. As I said, the numeric position of the higher note within the first note's major scale is called the interval's quantity. However, that's not the only part of an interval's name. They also have a quality. Think of the quantity as a noun, simply labeling the position of the higher note, and the quality as an adjective describing the type of interval we are dealing with. The intervals will be labeled using first a letter for the quality, then a number for the quantity. For example, M3 or P5. I'll say up front, this can be a little confusing at first, but bear with me and I promise it will make more sense as we get through this lesson. As we saw in the first two examples, the quantity of the interval is pretty easy. It is simply the position of the higher note within the first note's major scale. The quality, on the other hand, requires a little more attention. There are 5 qualities of intervals: major, minor, perfect, augmented, and diminished. The notes of the major scale give us major and perfect intervals. The second, the third, the sixth, and the seventh are all called major, while the unison, fourth, fifth, and octave are called perfect. Octave is the term used to describe the interval from the tonic to the repeat of the tonic. It is the 8th note of the scale, thus the term octave. Unison is a term used to describe an interval between two notes with the exact same pitch. In other words, from tonic to tonic, but not an octave away, the exact same note. So when we repeat the same note, the interval is called a unison. This is kind of silly to me because if the note doesn't change, then there is no change in pitch. So the idea that there is a term to describe the interval between a note and itself seems awfully contradictory. But this is a thing in music, so we need to know it nevertheless. Anyway, let's look at some examples of major and perfect intervals. If I want to know the interval from F to C, I would start with the F major scale. C is the fifth note of the scale, and fifths are called perfect. So I would call that interval a perfect fifth. Notice how the quality, perfect, is an adjective describing the quantity, a fifth. It would be labeled P5. What's the interval from A to C sharp? Within the A major scale, C sharp is the third note, and thirds are called major, so it would be a major third, M3. From E flat to D. In the E flat major scale, D is the seventh note, and sevenths are called major, so it would be a major seventh, M7. So found within the major scale, we have the following intervals: unison, major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, and octave. These intervals give us a way to discuss the notes found within a major scale without having to actually choose any specific major scale. Since all of the major scales were built using the same formula, the distance from the tonic to any of the notes will always be the same. These intervals are called the diatonic intervals. When we are exclusively using the notes of a major scale, we are being diatonic. But what about when we're not being diatonic? There has to be a way to describe intervals to notes that are not found within the major scale. For example, if I go from C to E flat is not one of the notes found within the C major scale. In other words, the interval from C to E flat is non-diatonic. Any interval that is not diatonic is called a chromatic interval. When labeling chromatic intervals, the quantity of the interval will not change. The position of the letter within the major scale will still be used in exactly the same way it is for the diatonic intervals. What will change is the quality. Here's how the qualities of our diatonic intervals will change. Any major interval that gets lowered by a half step is called a minor interval. Any perfect or minor interval that gets lowered by a half step is called a diminished interval. Any major or perfect interval that gets raised is called an augmented interval. I made this chart to help keep up with all of this, and I'll put a link in the description if you want to download and print it. It will be very helpful to keep this around until you get used to it, because there is a lot to remember here. From C to E is a major third. From C to E flat is still a third because the letter E is still in the third position of the C major scale, so the quantity has not changed. However, E flat is a half step lower than E, which makes the interval from C to E flat smaller. This is easiest to notice by looking at the chromatic scale. We can see clearly that going from C to E natural is a greater distance than going from C to E flat. So we've taken the major third from C to E and lowered it. Any major interval that gets lowered by a half step is called a minor interval. So this is a minor third, M3. It will be labeled with a lowercase m instead of a capital M to denote that it's a minor interval instead of a major. In fact, any time we are labeling either a minor or a diminished interval, we use a lowercase letter. Let's go through a few more examples. From B to F. Starting with the B major scale, the letter F is in the fifth position. So the quantity will be a fifth. However, the fifth note of the scale is actually F sharp, so F sharp is the perfect fifth. F is a half step lower than F sharp, so our perfect fifth has been lowered. A lowered perfect interval is called a diminished interval. So the interval from B to F is a diminished fifth, D5. From A flat to D. In the A flat major scale, the letter D is in the fourth position, so the quantity is a fourth. However, the diatonic or perfect fourth is D flat. D is a half step higher than D flat, so the interval has been raised. Any major or perfect interval that gets raised is called augmented. Therefore, the interval from A flat to D is an augmented fourth, A4. from E to D flat. Within the E major scale, the letter D is in the 7th position, so the quantity will be a 7th. The diatonic or major 7th is D sharp. In order to get from D sharp to D flat, we have to actually lower the note twice. When we lower it the first half step to D natural, it becomes minor. When we lower it the second time to get to D flat, it becomes diminished. So the interval from E to D flat is a diminished 7th, D7. I cannot stress enough how important it is to practice recognizing these intervals, and repetition is the only way to begin to dedicate all of this information to memory. Simply pick any two notes and see if you can figure out the interval between them. Remember, though, that there are some notes that are not used as the tonic of a major scale. If you find yourself trying, for example, to find the interval from D sharp to F sharp, you'll have a slightly harder time because there is no D sharp major scale. You can make one, though, by taking a D major scale and simply adding a sharp to each note. The notes of the D major scale are D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, and D. As long as I add a sharp to every note, I'll be adjusting every note by the same amount, so the intervals will all stay the same. It will still be a major scale. The notes will end up being D sharp, E sharp, F double sharp, G sharp, A sharp, B sharp, C double sharp, and D sharp. Now I can find an interval that starts on D sharp. The letter F is in the 3rd position, and I have to lower F double sharp to get to F sharp, so it is a minor 3rd. It's a little harder to keep up with because of the double sharps, but it does work. So what we have here is a much more accurate and useful way to describe intervals than simply adding up half steps and whole steps. It also gives us a way to discuss scales and intervals without having to pick a specific key to deal with, so we can create more general ideas and concepts that can then be applied to whichever key we are working in. The benefits of being able to speak generically about melodic and harmonic structures and techniques is fundamental to developing an understanding of music theory. This method of labeling intervals gives us the ability to do that. Earlier in this video, I mentioned that we need to think of all these intervals as going up in pitch. And in fact, every example we used did exactly that. But obviously, not all intervals go up in pitch. So we need to deal with intervals that go down in pitch as well. These are called inversions, and that is what we will cover in our next video. Until then, thanks for taking the time to watch. If you find these videos helpful, let me know by liking and subscribing, and let me know in the comments if there's anything I can do to help. As always, I really appreciate your time. Take care.